everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. Boom, gets bumped to the B block. That is right. I want to open with Texas A&M. We've talked about this job multiple times on this show since Jimbo Fisher was fired. And ultimately, after a little bit of a curveball on Saturday night, we got our next head coach at Texas A&M. Mike Elko, the Duke head coach, is hired at Texas A&M. This hours after what was ultimately a fan revolt when we thought it was going to be Mark Stoops. I'm going to talk about the Mark Stoops aspect of things momentarily, but I do want to start with Mike Elko, the head coach. Mike Elko is hired. He comes from Duke, and a couple things stand out. One, first of all, I really like the hire, okay? And first off, the ultimate thing that stands out, this search ultimately went a lot like I said it would. And I get a lot of stuff wrong. I'm not perfect. I make mistakes all the time. But if you go back and listen to the episode after Jimbo Fisher was hired, I said that I believe that ultimately Texas A&M, we're going to hear about all the big names, whoever they may be. It was obviously ended up being a Lane Kiffin, a Dan Lanning, a Dan Campbell. But I said they're probably going to end up with a guy like Mike Elko, former defensive coordinator at Texas A&M, knows the program, knows the players on this roster. And ultimately, let's be honest, a guy that's probably going to say yes because of the situation he's in at Duke. So I thought this was going to happen. Now that it has happened, let me just be blunt. I love the hire for so many different reasons. First reason, who he is, what he's about, okay? It's not a splashy hire. And I think if you're not super embedded in the Texas A&M or college football communities, you might sit there and say, Mike Elko, Duke coach, 7-5 season. I don't really know. That doesn't really feel all that exciting to me. Well, here's the thing. Do you remember the last hire at Texas A&M? That guy, Jimbo Fisher? That was the sexy name brand, we got to break the bank hire, and it didn't work. Jimbo Fisher, I don't want to say he was a disaster because Jimbo Fisher did some really good things, including elevating the talent base that Mike Elko is now inheriting. But Texas A&M tried the super sexy hire. They tried bringing in the national championship winning head coach. They tried overpaying for a guy that was on the back end of his career. And even before that, don't forget that Kevin Sumlin was deemed as a can't miss, no doubt about it, hire after a really good season at Houston the year before. And so they've done the splashy, sexy stuff. Mike Elko isn't that, but that isn't what they need. They need to use the cliche, pardon my take term. They need a football guy through and through that knows the school, knows the program, knows how to build and develop talent. And oh, by the way, it doesn't hurt that he has a relationship with a lot of these players. Elko, of course, comes from Duke. I think most people know, but part of why he was hired prior to being the head coach at Duke the last 2 years is I almost just knocked over my mic. Mike Elko was the head coach or was the defensive coordinator of Texas A&M. Goes to Duke for 2 years, and I thought he was phenomenal, okay? First year, he goes 9-4 at Duke. That is insane. Duke hasn't been that good in forever. This year, he goes 7-5. And some people would sit there and say, oh, he went 7-5, blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, but I think this year, in my opinion, kind of showed why Mike Elko probably ultimately had to get out of Duke. They started 4-0. They started 5-1. The only loss to Notre Dame on the final possession of the game. And then Riley Leonard, their star quarterback, gets hurt, and they simply can't sustain the level of success. Start 5-1, finish 7-5. I'm not great at math, but that's 2-4 down the stretch. But it also just shows you how hard it is to build and maintain success at Duke. And so because of it, you think about what this guy can potentially do at Texas A&M. Has proven in a short amount of time that he can be a head coach, that he can handle the responsibilities. But also what I like about him is that he knows Texas A&M. He's a guy that was there. He knows the strengths. He knows the weaknesses of the school, of the program. He knows the power players, the boosters, the administration. That stuff matters. It especially matters, I believe, at this particular moment in time in Texas A&M football history. Why is that? It is because, one, you have a super loaded roster for next year, which we're going to get into in a minute. And also, you are going into a season in 2024 in which the SEC is going to look completely different. Texas is coming. Oklahoma is coming. And that's why I was always thinking that I always thought that Mike Elko was the right. First of all, I wasn't even sold that you should fire Jimbo Fisher given the circumstances. But once that decision gets made, that was why you had to go get Mike Elko, because the last thing you want to do is completely rebuild from scratch. To have a roster that is good enough to compete for a national championship next year. And I'm not saying they're going to win one, but that roster is top 5 talent in college football. And you could not bring in somebody that had no idea about the school, the culture, the this, the that, and lose a bunch of players to the portal. And so now Mike Elko comes in. He knows the landscape. He knows many of the assistant coaches. This is, I think, an important part. And if you're an A&M fan, you already know this. Not that that entire staff doesn't necessarily need to stay, but there are key guys that probably need to be retained. Elijah Robinson, who was the acting interim head coach, E-Rob, was one of the elite recruiters in college football, excuse me. He has relationships with all those guys. Those players love him. You saw how hard they played for him, nearly beat LSU on Saturday at LSU. You need to retain him. There are other people that you need to retain in that building, but also you can put your own spin on it, bring in your own guys. Most importantly, though, and I just touched on this, and this is where I think Mike Elko specifically makes a lot of sense. He knows all those players. And so when you're talking about a roster that is top 5 talent in college football, part of the job of the next head coach was going to be to not only recruit and do this, and it was to re-recruit the roster that was in the building. And with due respect to Mark Stoops or whomever, those guys have no relationships with those guys. And so Mike Elko recruited a lot of guys on this roster. You can go back to when Mike Elko left to take the Duke job, and there was a thought that that 2022 recruiting class, the #1 recruiting class of all time, was about to fall apart because Mike Elko left and all those guys had such good relationships with him. And so this was one of the big things that I talked about when Jimbo Fisher got fired. I said, it can't just be about a 5-year plan and how are we going to build this into a national championship contender. It has to be about the 5-week plan of retaining the roster that you currently have. And that's exactly what Mike Elko, I believe, will do. Now, you're not going to keep everybody. Nobody retains a roster at 100% clip, not even Alabama or Georgia. But can you get most of that talent to come back? Because if you can, you have a team that bluntly is good enough to win the SEC next year, or at the very least good enough to make a 12-team college football playoff. Think about the guys on that roster. Think about the talent. If you can keep Connor Wigman healthy, if you can keep Walter Nolan, if you can keep whoever, that is a top 5 roster in college football. And so I don't mean to go on and on, but I like this hire. He gets the school, he gets the program, and I give Texas A&M's administration credit. We were crushing them on Saturday night, didn't love the way the whole Mark Stoops thing went down, but they saved themselves. They didn't get somebody that the fan base wasn't behind. The fan base clearly supports this. And I think Mike Elko is going to work. Now, again, I know you could probably find in the archives. I think, I don't know. I don't think I was doing this show when Jimbo Fisher was hired, but I'm sure there's an article or a quote somewhere. There's certainly tweets that I said, oh, Jimbo Fisher is going to be the guy. He's going to take A&M to the next level. I'm not saying Mike Elko is going to win national championships. But what I am saying is in the new SEC, you needed a guy that was going to come in, retain this roster, and hopefully build and frankly develop it in a way that Jimbo Fisher could. I like this hire for Texas A&M. Credit to them, credit to their fans for their patience, and credit to the administration for getting a guy that the fan base believed.